So one of the things that I've been doing for the last few years is trying to measure educational opportunity across the United States at a kind of relatively fine level of detail. And so one kind of crude measure of educational opportunity, but one that's widely available, is test scores. Now, we often think about standardized test scores as reflecting something about what kids learn in schools, but I think of test scores as more broadly a measure of educational opportunity. They reflect not only what children have had a chance to learn in their elementary or middle schools or high schools, but kind of all the sum total of educational opportunities that children have had up until the time they're tested. So they're reflective not just of what goes on in the classroom or in the school, but also of the kinds of early childhood experiences the child have had, of the quality of the child care or the preschool that the child had, of after school programs and opportunities, summer opportunities, and various other things. So that think of test scores as a way of kind of measuring the educational opportunities that have been available to kids in a community. And so to do that, then we've gathered test score data from every single public school in the United States for the last 7 years. So that's about 300 million test scores. As you know, we test our students a lot, and there's a lot of downsides to that. But the upside is it provides us a really good detailed measure of the pattern of educational opportunity in the United States. The other thing I should just say about the test scores is don't think of them as measures of intelligence. Certainly, they're measures of opportunity. They're measures of exposure to the kinds of material that's on the test, and they're measures of performance. And so they might reflect lots of other things, but they're not measures, particularly when we look at them in the kind of aggregate of innate intelligence or innate ability. They're really, I think, better thought of as measures of the pattern of opportunity available to children in different communities. And they're also not the only thing we care about in terms of children. I mean, if you ask any parent, they don't have children hoping that their children will have high test scores, right? What they want for their kids is for them to grow up and be confident, curious, and cooperative, and have good relationships with their friends and their family, and go on and do exciting, interesting, creative things in the world, right? Test scores are probably low on the list of what we all want for our kids. So in looking at test scores, I don't mean to sort of say this is what schooling or education is all about, but I think they're still a useful sort of measure of opportunity. So with all those caveats, let me sort of show you what we see. So we take these 300 million test scores, and we, at a very high level, just kind of look at the average performance of children on standardized tests in every school district in the United States. We do a bunch of stuff to equate the tests so they're comparable across different states and grades and years and so on. So we've taken all the tests that kids take around the country and sort of put them on a common scale. And the scale here is measured in sort of grade level units. So purple represents school districts where children are scoring well below the national average. The darkest purple is I think I can't read it now, 2.5 grade levels or more below the national average. And the darkest green is 2.5 grade levels or more above the national average. So there's clear variation in the kinds of opportunities that children have in different communities in the United States, ranging at the extreme up to 5 grade levels difference from the sort of high opportunity places to the lowest opportunity places. You can sort of see there's some geographic patterning of this. So lots of parts of the Deep South and parts of the Southwest and sadly California are purple, representing kind of lower than average opportunity, and a lot of the small suburban communities around metropolitan areas and in New England and the Northeast are places with higher than average opportunity. But at a finer scale, we could see a lot more. I don't have a sort of zoomed in map of California to show you today, but what we do have is we can now look at each of these school districts. So there's about 11,000 school districts here. And we can plot each of those as a dot. So each circle here is a school district. And on the horizontal axis is a measure of the socioeconomic characteristics of the families who live in that community and whose children go to public schools. So to the right is the more advantaged communities. To the left is the less socioeconomically advantaged communities. That measure of advantage is sort of a composite measure of the median income level in the community, the percent of families whose parents have a bachelor's degree or more, the poverty rate, the SNAP eligibility rate, the single-parent household rate, and the unemployment rate. So we take all of those kind of measures of sort of socioeconomic conditions and make a composite measure where 0 is sort of the national average. So a school district that's at the 0 on the horizontal axis is sort of the average socioeconomic conditions of a school district in the United States. And then on the vertical axis is this measure of the average test scores in the district, or think of it as a measure of kind of the educational opportunities that children have in that district. And 0 here represents a school district that's at the national average for a given grade. So that would be 5th graders in that district score like the average 5th grader in the country. So you can see a couple things. Again, you can see there's lots of variation in socioeconomic conditions across districts. That's the horizontal spread. There's lots of variation in the vertical spread. That's the variation in test scores or opportunity. And there's a really high correlation between the two of them. So kids growing up in the most affluent communities have much more educational opportunity than kids growing up in the poorest community. And there are very, very few places that are sort of on the left-hand side of that picture where kids score above the national average in terms of test scores, and very few places to the right where they score below. Knowing kind of something about the community where you grew up tells us, unfortunately, a lot about the kind of availability of opportunity. When we look just at the school districts in California, so same picture here, but now I've just highlighted the school districts in California. Those are the white districts, and for comparison, I put Texas here because Texas is similar to California demographically, as well as in terms of its racial ethnic composition, and so people often want to compare the two. But the California districts, and by the way, these are sort of the size of those circles represents the enrollment of the district, so it should be obvious where Los Angeles Unified is. But you can see that the California districts, on average, score below the national average for districts of the same socioeconomic condition. That's particularly true kind of in the middle income and lower income parts of the distribution. The most affluent districts in California, the ones way up at the upper right, are kind of like other affluent districts around the country in terms of their opportunity. But the middle class or the lower income school districts in California look like they have lower educational opportunities for children than comparable districts around the country. And Texas looks much more sort of like the national average in this sense. So you can't attribute, I think, the lower opportunity in California or the lower test scores to something like we have a lot of English learners and they score lower on tests, because Texas is comparable in that dimension, and we don't see the same thing in Texas. So that's a concern. Something is not going well in California in terms of educational opportunity relative to comparable places around the country. And then I made this picture, which is a little blurry and small print, but these are the 20 school districts, the elementary and unified districts. Not the secondary districts aren't in here because our test scores here on this are just from 3rd to 8th grade. These are the 20 districts serving elementary students in San Mateo County. So up at the far upper right, you have, for example, Hillsborough and Woodside and Los Lomitas and Menlo Park, Portola Valley, the affluent districts of San Mateo County, which have very high test scores, sort of fit the national pattern. And then you have the more middle class or lower income districts in San Mateo County, which are sort of like other districts in California. They're lower than the national average, but they're sort of comparable to many districts like them in California. So at the far left one, I think, is Bayshore and Ravenswood. And my vision is not good enough to read any of the rest of them. But you see the pattern in San Mateo County sort of mirrors the pattern in California, and with obviously some variation. But I think that says that we have a lot of work to do in California and in San Mateo County in terms of figuring out how to provide high levels of educational opportunity to children, particularly in the lower income and the middle income school districts of the area. Now, one thing about these is that we have test score data from 3rd through 8th grade, and we have it over a period of 7 years. So that lets us not just look at sort of the averages, but also look at school districts where test scores are improving rapidly from 3rd to 8th grade, or where they're improving rapidly over that 7-year period. And I don't have time to show you that today, but we have the data and we can sort of look in detail. But one thing that's worth knowing is that if you look at this picture, and this is the one I showed you before, this is for grade 8 test scores. And if you look at this one, this is grade 3. And so there's some slight difference here, but not a huge difference. In grade 8, there's a strong correlation between socioeconomic conditions in the community and test scores. And it's a little bit weaker in 3rd grade, but it's still quite strong in 3rd grade. That says most of that inequality and opportunity happens before kids get to 3rd grade. That is, it's not strictly something that's happening in the late elementary, middle school years. And in other data we looked at, most of those disparities are actually there when kids enter kindergarten. And so a lot of the inequality and opportunity that we see isn't so much because of inequality in the quality of schools, but inequality in the other kinds of opportunities available to kids in their homes, in their preschools, in their child care centers, in after-school programs, and so on. So some of the districts, I think Bayshore, for example, has relatively low test scores, but it has a very high growth rate. Kids learn a lot more in Bayshore from 3rd to 8th grade than they do in most school districts in the United States. So I haven't memorized all of the 20 districts, so I can't tell you what's going on in all of them. But just because you see low test scores in 8th grade doesn't mean the schools are necessarily of low quality. In many cases, we see big growth from 3rd to 8th grade. It's just that the kids are starting at a relatively low level and the opportunities are low in those sort of earlier years. And that says there's a lot of reason to focus our intervention efforts and our strategies in increasing opportunity in early childhood and in the early elementary years, when we know that interventions pay off a lot in those years and can have a long-lasting impact, not just on kids' educational opportunities, but on lots of other kinds of opportunities as well.